This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everybody. It is 10 o'clock and happy August. It's hard to believe it's already August at this point, but thank you once again for joining us for our Preservation Conversation series. And we are excited to bring today's topic to you. We think it's going to be extremely interesting for many of you, and I'm very grateful to our guest speaker today, who is out in the field. But our conversation today is local funding programs for historic homeowners. This is a topic that was trending back on the Massachusetts Historic Preservation listserv a few weeks ago, and we thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about, since preservation funding is always an important topic and frequently asked question, especially in regards to historic homeowners. And we are so very pleased to be joined today by our special guest speaker, Patrick Guthrie, who is with the Arlington Preservation Fund. And before we begin, just a few reminders, if you are not speaking, we ask that you please mute your phone. It just helps to keep down background noise, as this conference is going to be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel and website. If you have any questions, you can use the chat feature. It looks like a little conversation bubble on your GoToMeeting console. But also a little differently for this preservation conversation, after we have Patrick's presentation, if any of today's attendees are from communities that also have a local funding program for historic homeowners, and they would like to offer some thoughts or share a little bit about their local program, I invite you to simply type your name into the chat feature, and after Patrick's presentation, I will go through that list, and if you have submitted your name, I will then call upon you to share live. So changing up the format a little bit today. So just to briefly go back over what the purpose of our preservation conversations are, it's we began this way back in April to positively connect and communicate and share ideas about historic preservation related topics. And if you have any thoughts on how the series is going, ideas for future conversations, my email, along with the email of Chris Skelly from Mass Historic Commission, is going to be on at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to share your thoughts and ideas with us. So again, today's presentation is local funding programs for historic homeowners, with special speaker Patrick Guthrie, who is the principal of Design Associates Incorporated and also with the Arlington Preservation Fund. Also online with us today is the team from Preservation Massachusetts, myself, I'm Erin Kelly, Jim Igo, our president, our preservation circuit riders, Jeff Gagne and Stacia Kaplanson, and also Chris Skelly, the director of local government programs from the Massachusetts Historical Commission. So again, before I turn it over to Patrick, if any of our attendees online today would like to share thoughts about their own local funding program for historic homeowners, please type your name into the chat box, and when Patrick is done with his presentation and before we get to questions, I can call on you to share live. So with that, I will turn it over to Patrick. So Patrick, the floor is now yours, and whenever you would like the slide advanced, just let me know.
All right, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. This is a interesting topic. It is something where the questions come in all the time from homeowners. How can you help me preserve my home, especially after they've been through a visit to their local historic commission or historic districts commission and been informed on proper steps for preservation for their projects. Arlington's Preservation Fund is one of the older ones in the state. Can we go to the next slide? So it was established in 1983, so almost 40 years of handing out, of making loans to historic property owners. But Arlington, I think, like many towns in Massachusetts, likes to pride itself on its individual history. Founded in the 1635, and it was a village of Cambridge for a long time. It was once part of Belmont, part of Watertown. It got incorporated in 1806 as West Cambridge, And then after the Civil War, it renamed itself in commemoration of the Arlington National Cemetery. So that's where the name Arlington comes from. And the town's population is about 40,000. That's up a little bit from when the fund was founded, but it's been a pretty steady population for the town because it's largely built out, certainly by the end of the 20th century. Arlington's list of historic properties is about 1,000 buildings long, and that includes National Register properties and buildings that are in historic districts, and also individually listed buildings. So where did the fund come about? Well, in the 1980s, development was increasing in the commercial core of Arlington, and also homes that had been in family hands for generations were being changed. New ownership was coming in, and also the housing stock was getting a lot older, and people were needing to make repairs. And a group of citizens and the town planner were looking at the repairs being made and seeing that often historic features and character defining elements were being lost due to basic finances. It was too expensive to restore portions of their home to its historic character, given the cost of materials and labor. So a step was taken to offset that, and that was to establish a revolving fund where citizens could come to the fund and ask for a loan for preservation related work on their properties. And so through an application to the town planning and a request for funds through the Community Development Block Grant Program, that's a federal funding agency through the Housing and Urban Development Department. They put together a seed fund for starting the loan program. And over the last 38 years, we've received 108 applications. And of those 108 applications, we've issued almost $1.2 million in loans. Okay, next slide, please. So the process hasn't changed much in 40 years. We have a minimum requirement for eligibility. The property must be listed on Arlington's list of historic properties. And again, that includes local historic districts, individually listed properties, and also National Register properties in the town. And at the time that the guidelines were written for the Preservation Fund, it was determined that we would not be issuing loans to religious properties, at the time citing the separation of church and state, and we have not amended that rule. So we have a fairly simple one-page preliminary application process where we establish the address of the property, the amount of the request, and that amount is based on contractor estimates for the work. We request photos and descriptions of the work. When we receive that application, we call a meeting of the directors to review the application. Next slide, please. So we review the application and make certain that the building is indeed listed and meets that criteria, but also we look at the work that is scheduled to be done. And our criteria is fairly precise. The work needs to be either restoring an extant historic feature of the house, or it can be reconstructing a missing feature for the house. So we do require some documentation of missing features so that we can confirm that it is eligible for the loan. At that meeting, we'll make a determination of whether we are going to proceed with the loan or not, and also we will determine what the amount of the loan will be. Quite often, the requested amount and the contractor estimates for work may include items that we would choose not to fund, as it's not directly preservation related for the building. We'll issue loans in two manners. Loans less than $7,500. We place a preservation restriction on the property for a span of time twice the duration of the loan. And if it's greater than $7,500, then we, in addition to that preservation restriction, we also hold a mortgage on the property. Our loans are low interest loans. The interest rate is determined at our annual meetings, and that's typically half of the current prime lending rate. Okay, next slide. So just some statistics, 38 years in operation. The initial funding came from 2 subsequent community development block grants. As I've said, we had 108 applications. Currently, we have $50,000 in the bank available for new loans, and we have loan balances of $110,000. We have a 9-person board, and it's made up of people from the real estate, historic districts, historic commissions. We have an architect on the board. There's a member from the Community Development and Planning Office, and also one of the founding historic properties in town, the old Schwam Mill. Review of our loans includes a consensus approval from the Board of Selectmen. So in our process, when we have moved ahead with a loan, we then send that information to the Board of Selectmen, and typically they will concur with our decision. And then the grant or the loan applicant moves forward with the mortgage or the preservation restriction. All right, so that's the background and some of the dry statistics. Let's look at a few recent projects. These are all in the last 10 years. The first one is actually the old Schwam Mill in Arlington, and this is one of the exceptions to the rule. Typically, our loans are for exterior work, and on private houses, that makes sense because the intent is for this preservation to be of a public benefit. The old Schwam Mill operates as a museum and is open to the public. So in this case, there was interior work removing unsympathetic additions and changes made in the 1970s and creating a new wooden stair for access to a second floor space. Next slide. And this is just an exterior view of the L, and then a quick view through the window to the renovated space on the interior. Next slide, please. This is more typical of the loans that we issue. Here, the front porch was extensively altered over time, and our loan helped fund the restoration of the porch to its historic details. Next slide, please. This house, which was already well cared for, we were able to help the homeowner restore all 24 of the historic wood double hung sash. Next slide, please. This was another reconstruction of missing porch features. The front porch was fully reconstructed, and then the rear porch with the covered enclosure was built, and it was considered sympathetic to the historic design of the rest of the house. This had also gone through a local historic district review process. And then finally, sometimes they're pretty prosaic projects, and here it was just repointing the entirety of this contoured chimney using a a proper soft lime mortar, and it's an extremely tall chimney, so an important feature of that house. So that's a brief tour of the Arlington Preservation Fund and some of the things that we've been working on. So I'll let you take it away, Aaron.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for sharing a little glimpse into how the fund works. And we again, for those of people who may have joined after we began, if you represent a community that has a similar program and would like to share some insight or some thoughts, or a little bit about how your local funding program works, please feel free to type your name into the chat feature, and we'll call you. Oh, we have somebody who oh, that was a question. But just to let people know, we did also try to get the town of the city of Somerville to join us as well. Unfortunately, their planning office, which works with this program, is just under a really crushing workload, so they were very upset they couldn't join us. But as this topic was trending a couple of weeks ago on the Massachusetts Preservation Listserv, we did we came to understand that there was the Arlington program. There was obviously the Somerville program. Cambridge has a program as well, which I believe is probably similar in age to Arlington, if I'm not mistaken, but it has been around for a while, as well as Brookline. I believe Hingham has a similar program as well. Brookline has a revolving fund, like Arlington, originally funded with CDBG monies. There have been some questions that have come up as to whether or not these funds can be used. These funds could actually, these programs could be initially funded with CPA money. And that's something which I'm really not clear about. And I think something that Preservation Mass is going to work to clarify. So we have a couple of questions for Patrick. Patrick, do you know how much money the program started with when it began in 1983? Excuse me. How much money was the program begun with?
11. Okay. Yeah, 11.
I believe it started with $100,000, so it was two $50,000 grants from CBDG.
That's incredible. So from $100,000 to over $1 million loan. That's very, very impressive. What's the maximum loan that Arlington's ever made? Biggest one?
The most recent large one was $79,000.
And how long is your average loan term? We're getting into technical questions here.
Well, that's all right. When we had started out, the guidelines were suggesting 5 years as a standard. Typically, we will do 10 years now on loans. If you think about 108 applications over 40 years, doesn't amount to a large number per year. And some years there haven't been any loans issued. So it would be great if we could do them all at 5 years, because of course that replenishes the revolving fund, and also the interest has helped the fund. I mean, basically we have about $60,000 which has come from accrued interest in the revolving fund.
Have you ever been in a position to forgive a loan?
We've never had a default on the loan. Something that happens with our program more and more often is that we will be perhaps the second mortgage on a house, and then someone will go to refinance, and the larger institutions are not happy about having a second mortgage which will be ahead of them should there be an issue with financing or repayment of the loan. So we have been asked to subordinate our loans, and then sometimes people will get their second mortgage, and part of that will be used to pay down our loan. But yeah, fortunately, we've never had a default.
Great. So I think you kind of just answered this, but is a loan ever made regardless of existing debt that the property owner may have?
We talk about it at times because we do. I mean, like any institution that is lending money, we have to consider the ability of somebody to repay. And we have decided not to make a loan based on outstanding mortgages. I mean, we do a credit check. We do understand the income of the loan recipients and what their debt service is, at least as far as mortgages go.
When looking at the slide that you had that talked a little bit about the makeup of the Arlington Preservation Fund board, I noticed that you had, like you said, you had representatives from the real estate community, community development, and housing. When you're looking at an actual application, are those do you consider things beyond just preservation in general, or is how do the insights from the different members and their different expertise and representative communities, how does that impact how you evaluate and look at a project that's coming to your program for a loan?
Well, we use the different expertises to help us evaluate the well, for example, real estate. When we're evaluating the property and making the loan to the property, and we're looking at the amount of mortgage that is already on the property, that real estate entity is there actually to help us consider how safe this loan might be. The guidelines and really the application for the CBDG funding tied our program into a response to Arlington's master plan, especially with respect to preserving town character. So that's where the community planning representative is. But again, our guidelines are pretty strict on what we are loaning for, and that is really about the architecture, the historic pieces of the building. And the loans are far enough apart. I've never been in a conversation where we have been talking about the larger implications of a loan and deciding based on whether it contributes to a neighborhood or not. Hopefully that got to the gist of the question.
Yes, definitely. I think we have a question. How is the program refunded annually? Do you want to explain a bit about what, because you said it's really a revolving fund, how that actually, how are you able to turn $100,000 into making loans of over of over $1 million?
Right. So the way it's set up is you have, we'll call it seed money, but that $100,000 basically became our bank. And we are acting similarly to a lending institution. We're making loans. So the replenishment of that money comes from the payment of principal and interest on the loans that we have out. So there is no steady annual figure for the amounts that we have available. It's all predicated on loan payback and interest and basically the interest and principal that's paid back. So, for example, today's balance at around $50,000. It was $90,000 at the start of the year, but we gave out a $40,000 loan. But there's no additional input. All of the input from the outside sources happened in 1983.
Is there any, I knew this question would come up, and this is actually a very useful one, because part of the reason for having you on is to hopefully inspire other communities to think about establishing similar programs in their own city or town. Is there any way to get copies of bylaws or program details to assist a community in creating something similar for themselves. Is that something that would be, that would be able to be shared, or if you have like a model or something like that that people could look at without having to recreate the wheel? I know it might be a little different because you began with CDBG funds, but
yeah, I mean, we have copies of our bylaws and our guidelines that we can share. I think that the guidelines, the key part of that is the introductory paragraph, which says its purpose. And in this instance, because we were looking for those CBDG funds, we had to tie it to the community action plan for Arlington. And basically that was the avenue for the preservation fund. I think you do need to be demonstrating how this is of a community benefit.
Do you think the program has had a tangible benefit to Arlington over the past 40 years? I mean, 108 applications is and no defaults. That's amazingly successful. In your own opinion, do you think this has had has had a positive impact in meeting those, helping to preserve the character of Arlington and meet that initial charge of trying to preserve character, and has it had a positive impact for Arlington?
Oh, I would say definitely. I mentioned there's 1,000 structures which are listed as historic, and perhaps 10 times that many buildings in Arlington. So 108 is not a huge number, and a couple of those are actually repeat visitors to the fund. But I think every time we funded something, it's preserving or returning features that were missing to the town.
You had mentioned preservation restrictions. So when you obviously when you make a loan, you put a preservation restriction on the property. So is this what kind of? So obviously this is a term restriction that's put on the property, and is it one that goes through? Is it? I'm not sure. Is that just like a deed covenant that gets put on, or is this? All right. So what sort of preservation restriction do you put on the property, and would it stand if the property was sold during the period of, let's say, if it was two times the length of the loan? If the house was sold prior to the end of that period, would it continue to stand? So.
Yeah, it's attached to the deed. So yes, it stands through change of ownership. The language gets pretty specific. It says general preservation, and is also specific to the materials that were restored with the loan. I'm unaware of any circumstance in which, during the period of that restriction, there have been alterations that were made that would affect that restriction. I think we run into the issue that most volunteer boards do, is that you have something like this, and then what's the enforcement mechanism? And here it would be basically a commissioner who remembers the project going by and saying, hey, there's an alteration going on, or somebody dropping a dime on their neighbor. Typically, this stuff would first go through Historic Commission, because everything that is funded by us is either on a historic inventory for Historic Commission review, or it's in a historic district and would be there for historic district review. And since there is overlap on board members there, that's another avenue in which we get informed if something is happening with a project where we have the restriction.
Okay. Thank you, Patrick. I think we have a couple of people who represent a similar program and would like to speak. So first, Jim Ugone. I probably botched your last name. I apologize, but Jim Ugone, or Jim Ugone, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, this is Jim Ugoni, and thank you. I'm the chairman for the Rockport Historic Commission. And this is fascinating, and I was wondering if the money could, you could potentially circumvent some of the funding requirements, it seems, if you had a private, a seed pool, I'll call it, from private donations. So that was a third question I was going to ask. And also in Arlington, how do they define a historic structure? I guess many ways is my guess, but also terms of age. What are the number of years that you are using as a defining the historic age of a building?
Okay, well, just
Okay.
I can jump in, Aaron.
Yep, that's great. Take it back.
Okay, Jim. Our buildings have to already be listed as historic, so either documented on a inventory of historic buildings, or in a local historic district, or on a national register district. And we know that the criteria, the baseline criteria, is 50 years or older, with some exceptions. In Arlington, I think almost everything is over 50 years old that is listed. But we do not fund properties which are not already inventoried. With respect to private funds going into the pool, I don't know what the mechanics would be of that. I don't know enough about what the restrictions are of CBDG originated funds, but usually that sort of pragmatic private public partnership is pretty difficult to achieve because there are regulations, but I have not researched it one way or the other.
And I think, as I said before, I know that the question has come up whether similar programs could be funded initially with CPA funds. And I think this is something that PM will try to dig into a little bit more. And we know that there are a number of other programs out there, and trying to, and I know we've put Patrick under the spotlight here in Arlington, but trying to, but maybe coming up with like a little, a list or some snapshots of other programs, whether or not they're very similar to Arlington or some newer programs. I know on the lister, I believe it was Randolph had been trying to set up a similar program. So if we can get a little more information about programs, both well-established and some newer programs, and how they've been operating, how they function, to serve as a model that people can refer to. Just a couple other questions, Patrick. Can you describe the financial background checks for your applicants and who conducts that?
Yeah, we usually do a credit check, and we have had over the years different relationships with banks, and we just ask them to perform that, and then we'll go through and with the board expertise look at it and make our evaluation from there.
Okay. Does the Arlington the Arlington Auditor's Office manage the fund, or is this something that the organization does itself?
Yeah, we are separate from the town. We have interactions with the town, but the fund management is the responsibility of the Preservation Projects Fund. I mean, the Preservation Fund.
Okay. Let's see. Chris Hager. Chris Hager typed in his name. Chris, I don't know if you wanted to ask a question, or if you were going to comment on your community having a similar program. But Chris Hager, you can unmute.
Hi. Yeah, this is Chris. The question I had was in terms of the staff for this. Is it all volunteer staff in Arlington?
Yeah.
That's great. And how do you get people to volunteer for this organization?
Well, there are a lot of people who are interested in the historic integrity of Arlington, but sometimes you have to cajole people, and sometimes we also need to slide people around. For example, our clerk currently, who is representing the Historic Commission, used to be the realtor on the board. So when she moved on to represent the Historic Commission, then I had to reach out to several realtors and interview a couple to find one who was interested in being on the board.
Thank you.
So Patrick, you said you had a couple of repeat visitors for the fund. Is there a cap on how many times someone can come back to the fund for a loan?
We haven't reached that yet. When I said that 79,000 was the largest loan we had put out, they're typically, in the $15,000 to $25,000 range, and anybody who owns a historic home understands how far that actually goes. So there are typically more projects on a historic house than we can fund at one go. So returning projects come in and sometimes complete an effort that they weren't able to do the first time around, but no cap on that.
There's always more work to do on preservation projects. It never seems to end. So we have another question. Who was the initiating group that began the fund and sourced funding in 1983? How was it organized initially? And I know you said this was tied to Arlington master planning, and that's how you got you tied in the CDBG funds. So
right,
I
so
think you go ahead.
It was a group of people who were concerned with what they saw as a loss of historic integrity. They were doing several projects in town, and the town planner at the time was also very interested in helping groups of citizens find mechanisms for achieving their goals. So in the same time frame, the old Schwam Mill, which we had given a grant to, was preserved, and that was a similar grassroots group who got together. So just some forward-looking and concerned citizens and an invested town planner.
Kind of like the basis for how just how preservation movements get started. Just people who see change, who see something and want to address it. And in this instance, it was a tangible. How can we bring real resources to the table?
Yep.
Patrick, Arlington does have CPA, correct?
It does, yes.
It does. Okay. And what would be your advice for any of our participants or anyone listening? What would be your advice to a community who is wanting to start a program like this?
What would be the advice? I would find out what the town plan, if there is one, has to say about historic preservation, because I think regardless of how this is ultimately funded, you're going to need to have a broader constituency than just enthusiastic citizens. So Arlington was able to tie it into its town planning because there was something already in the documents about that. That said, you can also continue the grassroots way. Is if you don't have anything written in town documentation, then get a groundswell of folks who are interested in having it be part of the plan of the town to do preservation work. So I think obviously starting with your historic commission, your local historic district commission, if there are any arts organizations in town or museums in town, become an ally and friend of cultural institutions, because those are groups that are interested in preserving something about that town or contributing something to the unique character of the town.
Great, thank you, Patrick. And is the Arlington Preservation Fund a 501c3? Are you organized as a nonprofit?
Yeah, we're organized as a nonprofit.
All right, I think we got two questions about that. So I think that was pretty much all the questions questions.
Well, I saw that Chris had Chris Skelly had put in a question about or just a note that something that's on an MHC inventory form is not something that is listed, and I think that the point of the fine point there is that the listing is not that's Arlington nomenclature instead of state nomenclature for listing. So the inventory form, it's the inventory that is also held at MHC, but it says that the buildings have been investigated and determined to be historic with respect to Arlington.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. And someone just popped in. How can we get copies of the bylaws and procedures? Patrick, if this is something that you're willing to share, we can, and if you're okay with it, we can either send it out to today's attendees or put it on the PM website, whatever you're more comfortable with, or link through to the Arlington Preservation Fund. I know you have a website, if that would be more helpful.
Yeah, I can send you a PDF of the bylaws and the guidelines, and then you can put a link in maybe at the end of this recording.
Yep.
Okay.
Wonderful. I'll do that. So when you go to the preservation conversation page on our website, the document will be linked right there, so we can share that. And I think what we'll try to do is try to get some a snapshot of other programs from around the state. And very upset we couldn't get Somerville because it's a newer program, so it would have been a really good counterpoint to to the established program that you have in Arlington. But if we don't have any more questions, and I know we really put you under the spotlight today, Patrick, I apologize, but thank you so very much for sharing. This is it's a question that we get a lot at Preservation Massachusetts. I think people are always, are there funds to help me with my historic home? And I think these are great. I think people knew these programs existed, but if we can have a better sense of where, what communities have them, and encouraging people to look at other programs and be inspired and hopefully work to establish one in their own community, it's that many more resources and funding for historic preservation and helping people who are stewards of historic properties and really maintaining the character of our communities. So thank you so very much for sharing with us as you are out in the field, not even in an office. So I cannot thank you enough for sharing of your expertise and your insight with us today. So we're going to end a little bit early, but thank you all for attending today. And as I said, if anyone has any thoughts, suggestions about future presentations, not just preservation conversations, but future workshops that you would like to see either online or eventually when we are able to meet in person once again, my email is here, as well as Chris Skelly's email is right here. And our upcoming conversations, we're going to conclude our summer schedule on August 19th with a preservation conversation entitled Stone Walls, How to Identify, Document, and Evaluate Them in Historic Landscapes, with a special guest speaker and presenter, Jeff Howry. This is a little follow-up to our very successful stone wall conversation that we had at the end of June. And we're also going to be working on a fall schedule with some upcoming topics that include historic landscape preservation, archaeology, storytelling, and more. And we encourage you to check out our website later this month to get some more details. So once again, thank you all so very much for connecting with us. If you have any questions about this conversation or anything else, please feel free to call or reach out to Preservation Massachusetts. Even as we work remotely. But once again, thank you so very much to Patrick. Thank you to everybody for your questions. This will be on the website by tomorrow morning. Somebody just asked a question. The presentation will be on the website and also on our YouTube channel. A couple of questions were just asked. So thank you again, Patrick. Thank you all for participating. Thank you, Chris. Thanks to the PM team.
You're welcome.
and hope everybody has a wonderful day. Take care.